Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I've wanted to talk about Will Self again. I did a quick 5 minute or so video a while ago talking about Will Self's perspective on the decline of cinema. Um, and I was just fascinated by how he took his personal perspective and universalized it, which I think is just a common issue. I started talking, and so Siku, of course, is going to get into my lap now and cover up my face. But I found it fascinating how he took his own personal perspective and universalized it. I don't like movies anymore, therefore movies are in decline. It's not like a real, real statement of aesthetics. It's just a statement of personal opinion, which is entirely valid. Um, but I think it was the same. I've been watching a lot of Will Self videos for some reason. In the same video of a speech he did, he had a lot to say about Harry Potter, and I've been making videos about Harry Potter. My one Will Self video got more views than 3 or 4 or 5 Harry Potter videos. Um, not that I, not that I do this to get views. I've my brother has given me great advice on how to get more views, and I hated to tell him that's actually not why I'm doing this. You want to get more views, I know, just by being a doof. You want to get some more views, but I'm doing it to record my thoughts about how fiction works, mainly how storytelling works. My dogs are gonna fight. They were asleep. They were all quiet just a few seconds ago. Now that I started talking, they decided this is the time we need to start fighting, and were crawling around on top of me. So anyway, I'm really doing this to record my views, because of a consciousness of mortality. I had a good friend who just died not that long ago. He used to do a lot of Facebook Live videos. So it was sort of this consciousness of mortality and recognizing that if I don't record this stuff, and I just never get around to writing it because writing something I'm satisfied with takes so long, and I'd rather, usually when I sit down to do something like that, I'd rather actually write the fiction. I'm working on 30 stories simultaneously right now, so I have a lot of actual fiction to write. So I just never really force myself to write concepts down, but I can make a quick video. But anyway, so I'm also fascinated by the amount of attention something gets, not because I need the attention. I've been serializing stories on social media for seven long years. And they've never gotten any kind of attention. But I will study what gets more attention. So I'll study what, I do NaNoWriMo stories every November. And this year, for whatever reason, it dropped down to 25%. And it was up to like 90% like rate, just basic like rate. So it's fascinating what caused that to drop from 90% to 25%. I am too old to really care whether or not care really. I mean, certainly there's a part of me that does, but to care really if it gets a lot of likes. But the Will Self video got my first ever dislike. But anyway, but it is fascinating to see what really inspires responses and what really inspires interest. So Harry Potter being something really popular, there's an assumption that would get more views, but there's also a flooded market of people's responses. I've been watching Star Wars videos, and most Star Wars videos these days say everything in the world has been said about Star Wars possible, but I really wanted to say something else about Star Wars, and that's true about Harry Potter as well. But Will Self integrated this whole thing about Harry Potter into a speech where he called it drivel, which uh, is just being provocative, and I was curious what he actually meant how specifically do you find drivel? What about it makes it drivel? I wouldn't call it drivel personally. Uh, I some of the videos I've made about it in the past partly have been about just the fascinating way to view the sequence of the Harry Potter novels as J.K. Rowling um, learning to write a novel. So book one was sort of the learning novel, where a lot of the stuff she did was great, but a lot of stuff was you could recognize it as really amateurish. Book two sort of um, she learned by making huge number of mistakes. And then by book three, she really got into her stride. Um, I'm not making any sort of universal claims about it. That's really, me calling the mistakes is entirely personal in many ways, but I think there's a lot you can learn from it, and a lot you can recognize about the process of learning to write from looking at that particular sequence. And right now we're on Order of Phoenix, and it seems like Order of Phoenix is sort of settling more into the adult level type of novel, where book four was attempting to do a sort of an Agatha Christie sort of a structure where it set up all these threads. And book three did this really perfectly. Set up all these threads and paid them all off. Whereas book four sets up these threads, kind of leaves them dangling as possibilities for resolution of a particular mystery. So it's a huge amount of details, so many different plots going on at the same time, and each one gets resolved, and so the ending ends up being kind of tedious because she set up so many different plot threads. Entirely a personal perspective. Whereas book five, there's lots and lots of detail that doesn't have a plot function, and that's more like an adult novel. And I think one of the things that's brilliant about the Harry Potter series is that the writing itself matures. This might have been a conscious decision, I don't know, but the writing itself matures in many ways along with the reader. Year 11, it's sort of an immature book. Year 5, it's a much more mature sort of a book. So you have all these details. It's much, much more detailed. It's much longer. I was surprised it was so much longer than book 4 because there's so much less plot. Brilliant plot. It's very well plotted. That's something J.K. Rowling's great at. But book 4 just has 17 different plots, and book 5, has 3 or 4 plots going on at the same time. So anyway, I would never ever call it drivel, and I wouldn't call it drivel because I know there's so many people passionately in love with it. But then again, things that I truly do loathe, I'll go use that sort of terminology, like Ernest Hemingway, and I always have to remind myself. There are diehard Ernest Hemingway fans. I don't need to make claims about the universality of how bad Ernest Hemingway is just because I dislike it. And just as a full confession, one of the reasons I hate Ernest Hemingway is because I had so many people using him as the standard of greatness. I did not enjoy his work, just on an entirely personal level, but to have him used as this universal good, it turned my just pure dislike into loathing. But anyway, so a more interesting thing that Will Self said than just calling it drivel, he said that supposedly Harry Potter was going to lead to this new renaissance and people, kids being into books and buying books and enjoying, loving traditional books instead of TV or movies or what have you. And then he said it didn't happen. He said it didn't happen. He was very dramatic about it, which is surprising. That was the most surprising thing. Him calling it drivel. What? So what? That's just his opinion. But him saying Harry Potter did not lead to an increase in people enjoying kids, getting into books and loving books and enjoying books. And so I think this is a fascinating example of the availability heuristic. This is, I've been reading a lot of behavioral economics books this year, and one of them was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he talks a lot about the availability heuristic. He talks about all these different heuristics. And that's something always to be conscious of. So one of the things to always be conscious of, if you call something drivel, how do you define drivel? Are you defining that as a universal? or are you just taking a claim that is your own personal opinion and universalizing it? Very common sort of mistake a lot of people make in talking about and assessing the value of a story. Another one is the availability heuristic. So, in my response to it, I might have also been using the availability heuristic. So basically, the availability heuristic just means that you're judging something based on the available information that you have, things that are available to memory, things that have appeared, in the news more frequently. So the availability heuristic is why we think shark attacks are really common. They're not common at all. It's why we think terrorism is a great danger. Most people very, very unlikely to be killed by terrorism. But we have this sort of consciousness that this anxiety that if we go out into the streets, we're going to be killed by sharks and terrorists and sharknadoes and what have you. Because these make really interesting news stories, because they make really interesting news stories that really stick with us in our memories, that becomes available to us in our recall. So someone's saying, there are all these news stories about Harry Potter leading to this renaissance of reading among young people. That's an interesting news story. There weren't really follow-ups to those news stories that said, here is the generation that was born from reading Harry Potter. And so, I don't know what sort of thing Will Self is reading. Just out of curiosity, I looked at statistics. Book sales are fine. Some of the statistics. To really get away from the availability heuristic, you have to have really accurate statistics. A heuristic is just a simplification, a mental process that is designed to simplify. So if you have these really vivid memories of these really vivid stories in your head that show up in the news, for example, that's a shorthand. So the way to get around having that lead to mistakes and inaccuracies is to have accurate statistics. And to really get an accurate statistic on that, you would really need in-depth studies of a direct correlation between reading Harry Potter and increasing sales or what have you. So the reason that hearing that to me sounded entirely inaccurate may have been an availability heuristic on my part. However, I do watch a lot of BookTube videos, and every once in a while I'll go through the BookTube newbie tag just to get new BookTube channels that I enjoy. I'll see their newbie video just to see here are the types of books I enjoy. And from my perspective, it might be 90 to 99% of BookTube newbie tags, the question, what book caused you to, inspired your love for reading? It's in the 90 percentile. It's Harry Potter. It's the first one that they list. They'll say, well, the reason I'm a reader is because of Harry Potter. The reason I'm so obsessed with books is because of Harry Potter. And so, you can look statistically how many BookTube channels are there. There are thousands. So just from what I am consuming, it seems really huge amount of evidence that Harry Potter did lead to increased interest in books and love for books. Statistically, that might not be accurate. That might not translate. It might translate just to people who are passionate enough. I mean, just using logic and avoiding fallacies as much as possible. Logically, it might just lead to inspiring passion in people who become passionate enough to start a YouTube channel. So rationally, my perspective could be inaccurate. But I think, in assessing what a great story is, and assessing value in a story, and assessing patterns in reading and patterns in interests, you have to recognize these prejudices and these heuristics that you might have that really skew your perspective. So, something like the availability heuristic, the way to get around that is accurate statistics. But another way, just as a cognitive exercise, to to avoid the availability heuristic is inverting polarity. So, considering the opposite, there are different names for this. I don't remember the name Daniel Kahneman used, but what I call it is just inverting polarity. Just basically meaning that if you see something that bothers you or annoys you, try to think of it as the complete opposite, and that gets you out of prejudices and things like that, and gets you out of these heuristics that lead to inaccuracies. Uh, so if I said Will Self's entirely wrong, which I believe he is, but um, invert that polarity. What if he is right? What if he is correct? Like, what if it is drivel? How would you define drivel in order to justify him being correct in what he's saying? So, if I'm able to really effectively consider that, I can, eliminate some of the blinders. And what if it did not lead to this renaissance of people becoming obsessed with books? Then I can recognize, well, maybe my perspective is skewed because I watch a lot of booktube videos. Maybe in the booktube community, Harry Potter was this huge factor in inspiring this tremendously huge love of books. So I can recognize what might be flawed in my perspective by saying maybe Will Self is correct. And that goes with any sort of perspective that you have. Any sort of, and I would highly recommend it. If you are gleaning what makes a book good from something that you love, consider the direct opposite. Consider something that you hate. What would makes this something that if I were someone who loved this, what would I love about this? So if like Hemingway, um, that's not hard for me to do because the reason I hate Hemingway is because he was treated as this paragon of greatness. Um, so in order to eliminate any sort of prejudices that I might have, I would invert my polarity and say, um, what does make him great? Can I actually find a universal for my recognition that here is this particular writer that I do not love? Let me invert that and say, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm entirely wrong? What if the opposite of my belief system is true? Um, and this is where the rainbow circle. I actually have the rainbow circle with me this time. I've been doing so many episodes without the actual rainbow circle. This is where the rainbow circle comes in handy. There you go. There's my rainbow circle. If I could place it in a spot. So my belief system is that... Here comes Siku, of course. Don't crush the rainbow circle, please. But my belief system is that the core of the artistic act is to... Are you going to start growling at me? Are you growling at the rainbow circle? The rainbow circle is my friend. That the core of the artistic value is empathetic emotional experience. And so, in order to really make sure that I'm not blinded by just my, prejudices or my personal, entirely subjective values, if I truly want to claim that is a universal, I can invert the polarity. And I could say, so like intellectual value or universals, cerebral abstract universals as the destimulating factor that runs counter to that sort of empathetic emotional experience. If I said, what if I'm entirely wrong? What if the opposite is actually true? What if intellectual stimulation is the sole value that we should judge all books on? And I could recognize patterns of people making that sort of a claim. The kids' books are bad because they're dumb, something like that. That might be the basis of why Will Self calls the Harry Potter books dribble. Maybe. Because they're just not intellectually stimulating. I disagree personally, but if I were to get into his head and try to figure that out, if I were to say, what if he's correct? What if, what he says is correct? So in the rainbow circle, my example would probably be, could I imagine a book that is purely intellectually stimulating without being emotionally stimulating? I would find that very difficult to imagine. So you might use an example like 1984. 1984 is a book I abhor personally, but what if I were to hold that up as the greatest book ever written? And the justification that I would give is that it is intellectually stimulating. That's what makes it great. That would eliminate so many great books that are far more emotionally stimulating than they are intellectually stimulating. However, let's say this is my proposition. What if I were to claim that 1984 is the best book ever because it is the most intellectually stimulating? Could I conceivably buy into that? I would still argue, recognizing, sort of getting out of my perspective, I would still recognize what makes 1984 appealing is not necessarily the argument that it's making. There is a certain amount of value for that, for arguably non-aesthetic value to making that sort of argument. But I would argue that what is actually really appealing about Big Brother and all that sort of stuff is that it is terrifying. So that's still, I'm trying to navigate. There you go. That is still, visceral stimulation. The Big Brother is bad because it reflects all these things in reality, sure. But really, what makes it a compelling novel and forces you through the novel, arguably, it's still the visceral stimulation. So I can recognize the other position. I can recognize why someone might argue that intellectual stimulation is the highest value. Cerebral abstraction is the highest value. I can recognize that, but I would still argue that even despite that argument, it's far more compelling to say that visceral, emotional, irrational stimulation at the core here, trying to navigate backwards. There you go. At the core here, I would still argue that is central value. So that's a way of sort of getting around the availability heuristic and getting around these sort of limited perspectives without necessarily going into statistics. Are you able to conceive of the opposite? If you're could you conceive of maybe sharks aren't the most dangerous thing for me to worry about? Maybe terrorism isn't the thing I should be anxious about. What should I be anxious about? What is more likely to kill me? Cars might be more likely to kill me. Well, I should be more safe on the road, that sort of thing. So, but anyway, there's my PSA for today. Have a good day, and I'll see you on the next episode.